I'm Ryan, and this is my final video in my summer series, Indonesia. Sarah and I have had an incredible month of turquoise waters, soft sand, shocking wildlife, and delicious food. Indonesia is a great place to travel. I learned a lot, and I want to share what I know with you, both the positives and the negatives of traveling Indonesia. First off, here's an overview of our trip. We started in Bali, but we stayed only in Ubud for about 4 nights. I know a lot of you are probably planning a vacation just in Bali, but we wanted to try and get a feel for the entire country, and Bali is quite different from the rest of Indonesia. After Ubud, we flew to Labuan Bajo, where we hung out for a few days and did a boat tour to see the Komodo dragons. Then we did some cross-country traveling to get a sense of the local life. This was one of the roughest parts of our journey, but it gave us a sense of what the tourism industry has done for the country. It was just a day and a half, really. We took a ferry, and then we took a bus, and we flew off to Lombok. Hello. Lombok is similar to Bali in that it's set up for tourists looking for beach getaways, surfing, snorkeling, and relaxing. That's pretty much what we did for 8 days, and then we flew to Sulawesi, the south part, to Makassar, which is the capital of the south part of Sulawesi. This was actually our first real Indonesian city, so it was a great experience. We hung out there for a few days. They have a really good food scene. And then we finished off the month in Bira, a beach town on the southern coast. White sand beaches, turquoise waters. That's where we are right now. And I think we got 2 days left. We'll go back to Makassar tomorrow and then fly out from there. It'll be, I think, exactly a month, which was planned because Indonesia, for a lot of countries, is visa-free for a month. So you can see this cabin behind me. This is a good example of a type of accommodation you get in Indonesia. I would call this the beach bungalow. It's very basic, but I can see the ocean from here, and the beach is just a short walk away. We paid $40 a night for a beautiful room, steps away from a pool, surrounded by rice terraces in Ubud, but you can certainly find cheaper. In Makassar, there's a lot of competition. We stayed in a pretty fancy Ibis hotel for about 25 bucks a night. This beach bungalow was about the same. I think the worst room we stayed in was about $15 a night, and it was horrible. It was pretty bad. The staff was always accommodating. Most rooms included breakfast. To get a pool was not that much more expensive, so that was a nice little thing to have to cool off because it is pretty hot here. Compared to the rest of Southeast Asia, I'd say Indonesia's pretty good. I'd compare it to Thailand's accommodations. That big gecko, I found it in our room, hanging out on the walls. And he told me he was going to try to sneak into your underwear while you slept. Let's move on to transportation. I actually did a whole video about transportation, so if you want to click the link above, you can watch that. It's more detailed. It shows all the different types of transportation. Or you can just watch the summarized version now. My light just changed drastically. Did you notice that? Oh, it's coming back. It's coming back. Yes. Since Indonesia is an island nation, we ended up flying a lot. The flights were all pretty cheap, like maybe 30 bucks to 50 bucks. They saved us a lot of time and probably hassle, although it's pretty common for flights to be delayed in Indonesia. If you're looking to save money bouncing from island to island, ferries are plentiful and they're very cheap. We had one ferry ride. It was about 7 hours long, which was pleasant. I enjoyed it. I think by the end of the 7 hours I was ready to get off though. But the longer journeys will have bigger boats. I think we paid $60,000 or about $4 for the 7-hour ride that we took. Just kind of a little sip, just to wet my willy.
Wet your whistle is what it's called.
Oh yeah, sorry. Wet my willy. Where was I? To give you an example of the cost of flights versus ferries, we went from Bima to Lombok by plane, which only took like 30 minutes. It cost us about $35. And to go by bus And ferry combo, it would have taken 12 to 15 hours and cost $15 to $20. So like a $15 difference maybe. Sarah, jeez. Buses in Indonesia are really more like minibuses. They're pretty cramped for a 6'2" person like myself. I can really bear it for like maybe 2 hours before it's just too much. But we didn't really see too many of these. The more popular option is the BMO, or the Pedi Pedi it's sometimes called, which is more of a city public transportation but also does trips between towns and cities. These are gutted out vans, very basic. I believe these are independently owned by the drivers, so you're probably more likely to get overcharged on them. One trip, which was about 2 hours, cost us $75,000 per person, and then on the way back with a different driver, they charged us $50,000 per person, but we could see that the locals were paying like $30,000 per person. Of course, you want to negotiate the price ahead of time, which we always did, but they were pretty strict. When it came to foreigners, they didn't have much leeway. Sarah's taking selfies out there with people. Another popular way of getting from town to town is by sharing an SUV. They usually cost more than a BMO, but I think it's easier to negotiate them. For the most part, they're more comfortable. We took one for about 7 hours, which was a really long time. I was cramped. It wasn't great. It was hot, but it only cost us $100,000 each, about $7. And they'll often drop you off right at your destination. Taxis are always my worst enemy, but in Indonesia they have Grab Taxi and Uber, which is nice. I think Grab is more popular, but in places like Bali it's been outlawed. The mafia-like taxi drivers protested it, and I think it was like a violent protest, and the government eventually caved. So it's not illegal, but it's hard to find Grab drivers there. They'll only pick you up in certain spots. They won't drive into the airports, stuff like that. A lot of the regular taxis won't want to use the meter. Most of these are unmarked, and they don't work for a taxi company, but they'll yell out, "Where are you going?" So that's how you know they're taxis, I guess. The larger cities do have actual taxi companies that will use the meter, and they're relatively cheap, but I think Grab Taxi is definitely cheaper still. Of course, compared to the West, a lot of people drive like maniacs. They honk the horn all the time. Many of the vehicles have their seatbelts removed, but that's all kind of the charm of Southeast Asia, unless you crash, I guess.
This is local transportation, kind of a local motorcycle taxi. I guess their version of a tuk-tuk. It's interesting because you sit in front, there's a lot of dirt coming in my face, and we got the driver back here behind me.
Food in Indonesia is quite delicious. You'll eat a lot of nasi goreng, which is fried rice. The seafood obviously is fantastic. Be sure to get grilled or fried fish, which will be a whole fish. It might come with some rice and a few slices of cucumber. If you get the fried version, eat the fins. Trust me, it's the best part. The average meal out will cost you maybe $50,000. That's about $3.50. You can definitely find more expensive, but you'll also be able to find cheaper, like a plate of rice that'll fill you up for like $1.50, something like that. On the plane ride over, we actually studied a bit of the food vocabulary, and I think it was really useful. Words like beef, chicken, grilled, fried, whatever you think you're going to eat, basically. A lot of the menus do have English, but if you like to get off the beaten path, you might have to translate some menus. We got pretty good at this. I'd say like 3 weeks in, we were able to read menus pretty much in their entirety without any help with translation apps. In tourist towns, you'll find a lot of Western food that's actually really good. The many expats that live in Indonesia can be thanked for that. There are also some restaurants that have adapted Indonesian food to a Western palate, but I find the cuisine doesn't need that much adjustment. Some of it will be too spicy for sure. Some people might be put off by the shrimp paste, but overall, it's pretty standard techniques with pretty standard ingredients. Be sure to try satay. It's grilled meat with like a peanut sauce. Gado is kind of the vegetarian version of that. Basically parboiled vegetables in that same kind of peanutty sauce. Beef rendang is fantastic. It's a slow cooked beef with a coconut milk spice combo. There are plenty of other local specialties that you shouldn't miss, so I recommend Googling them when you arrive to a new island.
Just getting some coffee to go. This is the coffee place. This guy's making up my coffee for me. Some beautiful live music though.
Coffee in Indonesia ranges from excellent to, I would say, chalky. Because of the way it's brewed, the local coffee is quite bitter and it requires a lot of sugar, but the beans that are grown in Indonesia are pretty good actually. You shouldn't have too much trouble finding a cafe that has an espresso machine that does a really good cup of Java. And yes, Java is named after the island in Indonesia, Java, which is famous for growing coffee beans. Probably my biggest problem with Indonesia is the lack of beer. I love beer. I like to sit seaside with a beer. Sometimes I like to drink many beers. Indonesia's star beer is called Bintang, which literally means star. It's a typical Pilsner. In Bali, a predominantly Hindu island, you'll have no problem getting beer at most convenience stores. But most of Indonesia is Muslim, and many of the islands have outlawed the selling of beer in mini markets or even grocery stores. In these places, you have to get beer in hotels or in restaurants. Some towns we went to were completely dry. Beerless to me is not a good way to spend a holiday. Fresh seafood by the sea. The only thing that would make it better. What? Beer prices for a large 620 milliliter bottle like this guy here range from 35,000 IDR, or about $2.40 to, well, we spent 100,000 on one beer once. That's about $7, but it came with a fancy sunset. Finally, I want to talk about staying connected in Indonesia. The Wi-Fi in most hotels is alright. Sometimes you'll have problems with it, but if you're not an internet whore like I am, you'll probably be fine with that. Plus, the restaurants and the cafes will have internet usually. That being said, for me, it was totally worth it to pick up a local SIM card from the airport, about 10 bucks I think it was. And that gives you 4 gigs and it lasts for the whole month. It just made it a lot easier to find our way around, to find places to eat, to use Grab Taxi, and even call hotels that are hidden away from main roads and are really hard to find. Okay, I think that pretty much covers it. Overall, Indonesia is very hospitable. It's a great place to travel. A lot of the country is set up for tourism, but when you get off the beaten path, it does become difficult. The amount of people that speak English drops off dramatically, but that can be expected, and it really wasn't much of a problem. Off the beaten path definitely is rougher though. It's two different worlds basically. But if you have the time and you're not just there to relax, I suggest you do go check out a non-tourist town, because it really does show you the impact that tourism has had on the country. Well, thanks for watching, and please subscribe below. I'll be back with lots more adventures, so stay tuned. And thank you to Indonesia for being so great. We'll be back at a later date. Beatles style.